Okay, in this video I'm going to talk about how to compose materials in Photoshop rather than rendering them in as textures in V-Ray or Enscape. So I have here a rendering done in Enscape just with generic materials, and I'm going to talk quickly about just how to kind of map textures onto surfaces and get them to line up and kind of look cohesive in the scene. So I'm also going to bring in, you watch the video on exporting channels in either, this method works in either V-Ray or in Enscape. Then you should have some images that look kind of like that. That will enable you to kind of select individual objects or individual materials and start to crop and select more quickly. So I'm going to go and just find a texture. I'm going to call this my CMU all texture. And one of the nice things about working this way is that we can use kind of a little bit more freedom to apply textures without having to worry about the, having like tiling and repetition effects or, things being kind of super perfect. Let's see, although this one of the other things you want to watch out for is just that you have a image that's good enough resolution. It's not going to look pixelated. So again, you can go to tools and size and just search for only large images on Google when you're searching. Might look for something that has like a little more texture going on. There we go, let's try that. Okay, and bring that image in. Okay, so the first thing we got to do with an image like this, it isn't large enough to kind of, let's say we're going to try and kind of apply this texture to these two walls right here. It isn't large enough to like go across the whole surface of those two walls. What you want to do is first like expand your kind of material swatch, and that's before you start to put it in perspective or anything like that. So I'm gonna first I'm gonna rasterize this layer. So I'll right click on it, I'm gonna rasterize, and I'm gonna hit Control J on the keyboard. You can also right click on the layer and go to duplicate near the top like that. So I have a couple of them here. I'm just gonna try and like line them up. So it's pretty easy with CMU because you got the seams, and obviously we're already running into issues there. And then we can just kind of mess with it until it looks how it should. And so we'll get the seams to line up. That up a little more. Looks good. And then what I'll do is I'll apply a layer mask. Use my paintbrush with a kind of soft edge. Just feather the edge. And so I realize these are barely overlapping. Really gently. Actually, that one's below, so I'm not even sure why I'm doing that. So we want to do this one. That way they kind of, we don't see like a hard edge between one texture and the other in the face of the block. So again, like right there, we want to go ahead, soften that up. And with a pattern like this that's pretty, pretty varied, you won't see a lot of repetition. I'm going to go ahead and just collapse all those layers. I'll select them all, and you can go to merge layers, and then I'll make another copy. And, let's see, maybe put this. Make sure those both Same thing as before, I'll make a layer mask. Soften up the seam. Great. And merge them again. Like that. And once I get close, I'm using the arrow keys to move them precisely on the keyboard. Okay. For my edges, it's right there. Okay, that looks pretty good. And I'll merge those. And now we have a pretty massive texture. We might even want to just like let's crop it because that extra is not really going to help us. Cool. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pattern. I'm going to copy it because I'm going to apply it to a couple of different walls, and I'm going to distort it so that it's matching the perspective of whichever surface I want it to belong to. And before even I get to that step, I'm going to go ahead and go onto my Object ID channel here. I'm going to use the paintbrush tool, select the surface I want to be on. Oops. Alt to just, I want to get that right over to that seam there. The corner is. Do that one more time. Awesome. And then I'm going to go ahead and crop that. And then so I'll turn it back on. So you can see it's cropped. It's only showing up where it would on that wall. And like I mentioned in our tree and scale figures video, if you click the little link button between the layer mask and the layer itself, then select the layer. Select the layer, Control T, free transform, right click and go to distort so I can start to get my perspective lined up. So it's going to transform the image without transforming the cropping boundary, which is great. That looks pretty good. In fact, that's small. Also using Shift because I want to kind of keep my edges really nice and straight. And now I'm kind of looking at where my seams are and seeing if I can get them to line up. Cool. Right. That's fine. That's good. Okay. So now we have like one, I'm going to do one more real quick here. Actually, we probably want to use this. To make sure our seams line up there. Cool. Make sure they're roughly the same scale. Obviously, we need the seams to line up on this end. Good. And then just from this side. Big. Little. So yeah, we're just trying to get this to line up, and it's actually a little bit trickier with a texture where we see horizontal seams and vertical seams, because then we really got to nail the alignments and the scale and everything. Right, and so there's two walls like that. You can see they kind of look like blocky. There's a couple ways you can, one issue that's happening here is like we're not seeing the texture wrap around the edges. Which would be an easier thing to do if we didn't have CMU. But you could go through and do those independently if you really wanted to. I think the other thing you can do here is like you could start to like actually shade, your for example, if we use the lasso tool, we could start to like shade our wall as though it was in the scene. We could even do this kind of thing, like with um, even do this kind of thing just by working block by block and outlining and adding gradients. Oops, that was the wrong button. If we really wanted to. And that would start to give it depth and things like that. So that's one way to go. And so same thing we could do. We could kind of shade things in that way and give it a three-dimensional appearance. The other thing you can do is you can do just kind of like a basic, which kind of look really nice. You can also you can just kind of do it in a more simple way, like maybe we just use an adjustment for each face. Then we kind of start to, shade our faces of our scene a little bit, like bit by bit. That we start to make it appear more three-dimensional. That's another way to go. And I think the other way to go is if you just have a kind of basic rendering like this one without any materials applied, but obviously we have lighting effects and shade and shadow and everything like that. We can actually just take the texture and apply it as an overlay to our scene. Oops, did not that overlay. And so it starts to, right there, it starts to pick up some of the differences in terms of the corners of the faces. Not so much there, we might need to hit that. And it looks pretty natural. It starts to create the three-dimensional effect that you would want it to. So fast forward a little bit, here's an image that I've done that's a little bit more developed, and you can see there's a texture applied to the ground plane, applied to the walls, things are scaled, etc. As you can see it a little bit more. And it looks pretty clean and kind of has an interesting style. So, if you wanted to kind of carry it out further, and then that also, of course, like I mentioned before, allows you to do more with the textures, in terms of drawing on images of textures that might have a little bit more detail and kind of imperfection than what you see here. So I think the other thing I wanted to point out is you can do this with so this is an Enscape base rendering I have here, but also have like V-Ray renderings, and one of the things, you turn off that base layer. So there's our V-Ray. Oh, actually, let's leave the base layer on. But one other way to do this, and if you remember, if you watch the channels video from our V-Ray, so we have like an atmosphere layer, and we have a reflections layer, we have fractions, so on and so forth. So those then become things that we can use as overlays. And start to do the same thing. And get some of the depth, and I don't need to do that like that, but and obviously we would then need to kind of balance it out with overall adjustments to our composition and so on. And some of these can be different. But that's another way to go. So you can kind of use the adjustment, or I'm sorry, the channels that you export from V-Ray as a way to get the kind of same effect. And you can export, the reflections and the shadow and the shading and all that kind of stuff to kind of overlay to your materials and get them to appear a little bit more like they kind of fit in the scene and so on. And so I think that kind of concludes it. Like, I think you have a lot more flexibility if you apply materials in Photoshop. And again, the CMU is kind of a tricky one because you have to get the scale of it to really work quite accurately to make it look right. But with other textures like this concrete texture, I just kind of skewed it, scaled one in, and it looks fine. And so we can start to get like a little bit different style that way. So that's one alternative for developing materials in your renderings. And I will sign off.